Welcome to the world behind midnight, where the darkness reveals truths civilization forgot. Tonight's story will test everything you believe about what hunts in the wild. They briefed us on hostile wildlife. What they didn't mention was that the wildlife had been studying our tactics for generations, learning our weaknesses, and waiting for the right moment to show us we were never the apex predators we thought we were. The mission briefing lasted exactly 7 minutes, which should have been our first warning that something was catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford stood at the front of the tactical operations room, his weathered face illuminated by satellite imagery that showed nothing but endless pine forests stretching across the border between Washington State and British Columbia. He spoke in that clipped, emotionless tone that career officers use when they're delivering orders they don't fully understand themselves, and every word felt like it was hiding something darker underneath. Containment and assessment, he called it, as if those sanitized phrases could somehow make what we were about to face feel routine and manageable. Our 8-man team had been pulled from active rotation without explanation, yanked out of training exercises in Fort Bragg, and shuttled to a classified airfield in the Pacific Northwest within 18 hours. Captain Brennan, our team leader, had 23 years of special operations experience, spanning 3 continents and more black sites than most people knew existed. Sergeant First Class Villalobos had survived firefights in Mogadishu and mountain ambushes in the Hindu Kush, his instincts honed by decades of close-quarters combat, where hesitation meant death. Specialist Kowalski was our communications expert, a tech genius who could jury-rig satellite uplinks from scavenged parts and maintain operational security in the most hostile electronic environments. The rest of us filled specialized roles, each hand-picked for skills that made us effective in situations where conventional military doctrine stopped being useful. What bothered me most about the briefing wasn't what Ashford told us, but what he carefully avoided saying. The target area was designated as Zone 17, a stretch of wilderness so remote that even the logging companies had abandoned it decades ago, leaving nothing but old-growth forest and terrain so rugged that rescue operations were considered unfeasible. Multiple civilian disappearances over the past 6 months, he explained, all within a 12-mile radius of coordinates that kept appearing in incident reports with disturbing consistency. Local law enforcement had classified them as probable animal attacks, but forensic evidence recovered from the few remains they'd found showed patterns that didn't match any known predator species in North America. Brennan asked the obvious question, his voice cutting through the sterile briefing room air with the kind of directness that comes from too many missions where bad intelligence got good soldiers killed. What kind of animal are we dealing with? Ashford's hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, but in those seconds I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach turn cold. The forensic reports are inconclusive, he finally said, which was military speak for, we have no idea what did this, and we don't want to admit it. What we do know is that the attack patterns suggest coordinated behavior, intelligence significantly above normal wildlife, and physical capabilities that fall outside established parameters for regional fauna. Villalobos caught my eye across the briefing room, and I could see the same concern reflected in his expression that was growing in my own mind. Coordinated behavior meant pack dynamics, possibly multiple predators working together with tactical awareness. Intelligence above normal wildlife could mean anything from unusually clever wolves to something that had learned to anticipate human responses. Physical capabilities outside established parameters was the phrase that really worried me, because that was how military analysts describe threats they couldn't categorize using existing biological frameworks. The satellite imagery showed topographical features, elevation changes, water sources, but nothing that explained why 3 separate reconnaissance drones had experienced catastrophic systems failures within that zone over the past 2 weeks. Our insertion would happen at 2,300 hours, during the new moon when natural darkness would provide maximum concealment for our approach. 2 UH-60 Blackhawks would drop us at the northern perimeter of Zone 17, and we'd proceed on foot to investigate the last known location of a missing forestry survey team that had vanished 4 days earlier. Their abandoned campsite had been discovered by a search and rescue helicopter, but the crew reported seeing movement in the surrounding timber that made them abort their landing and return to base without deploying personnel. Radio communications from that site had become increasingly erratic in the hours before contact was lost, filled with reports of strange sounds, and the growing conviction among the survey team that they were being watched by something that stayed just beyond visual range. The equipment manifest included standard combat loadouts, night vision optics, thermal imaging scopes, and enough ammunition to fight our way through a small war. But Ashford also authorized the inclusion of tranquilizer rifles loaded with enough sedative to drop a grizzly bear, plus portable trauma kits with antiseptics and antibiotics typically reserved for biological contamination scenarios. When Kowalski asked why we needed biowarfare protocols for a wildlife containment operation, Ashford's response was deliberately vague. "We're taking precautions against all potential threat vectors," he said, which translated to, "We don't know what you're walking into, and we want you prepared for anything." The flight north took us over the Cascade Range, following terrain that gradually transformed from civilized valleys, with their neat grids of agricultural land, to increasingly wild country, where human presence became sporadic and then non-existent. Through the helicopter's small windows, I watched the lights of small towns give way to scattered homesteads, which eventually disappeared entirely into unbroken darkness, broken only by the silver threads of rivers catching moonlight. The forests below us were primordial, unchanged since before European settlement, and from this altitude they looked peaceful and eternal, like something from a nature documentary about wilderness preservation. Brennan gathered us for a final equipment check as we approached the insertion point, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise but carrying the weight of command authority that came from leading men into situations where mistakes meant body bags. "Standard patrol formation," he shouted. 20-meter intervals, weapons hot. And maintain radio discipline unless you've got something worth reporting. His eyes swept across each of us, looking for signs of hesitation or doubt. But we were all professionals who had been in worse situations and survived through a combination of training, discipline, and the kind of luck that runs out eventually. What he didn't say, what none of us wanted to acknowledge, was that this mission felt different from the beginning, like we were being sent to investigate something that had already decided how the encounter would end. The Blackhawks descended through layers of cold air that smelled of pine, resin, and glacial runoff. The pilots navigating by instruments through darkness so complete, it felt solid and physical. As we dropped below the tree line, the forest canopy swallowed us, and I caught my first real glimpse of the terrain we'd be operating in. Ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars towered into the night, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't have encircled them with linked arms, spacing between them creating corridors and chambers that channeled movement along predetermined paths. The undergrowth was dense but not impenetrable, a mix of sword ferns and salal that would provide concealment while allowing reasonably quiet movement for trained operators. We fast-roped into a small clearing that barely accommodated both aircraft. Boots hitting soft earth covered in decades of accumulated pine needles that muffled sound and left clear impressions of our landing. The helicopters lifted off immediately, their rotor wash creating a vortex of disturbed air and debris that settled slowly in their wake. And then they were gone, disappearing into the night sky and leaving us alone in a silence so profound it felt like the forest was holding its breath. No insect sounds, no bird calls, no rustling of small mammals going about their nocturnal business, just absolute quiet that pressed against eardrums and made every small noise our equipment made sound explosively loud. Brennan gave the hand signal to move out, and we formed up in tactical column, each man maintaining his assigned interval and sector of responsibility. I was third in the formation, positioned where I could provide cover for the point man while maintaining situational awareness of our flanks. Villalobos took point, his decades of experience making him the logical choice to read terrain and spot potential threats before they became immediate dangers. Kowalski brought up the rear, monitoring our communications equipment and watching our 6-4 signs of pursuit or encirclement. The spacing between us was precisely calculated to allow mutual support while preventing a single ambush from taking out the entire team. The forest floor was treacherous despite its soft appearance. hidden roots and uneven terrain requiring constant attention to avoid twisted ankles, or worse. We moved slowly, deliberately, using the hand signals and whispered commands that special operations teams develop, through countless hours of training until they become a second language more reliable than spoken words. My night vision goggles painted the world in shades of green and gray, transforming the darkness into a comprehensible, if somewhat surreal landscape, where every shadow could hide threats and every movement demanded immediate evaluation and response. 30 minutes into our patrol, Villalobos raised a closed fist, and we froze instantly, each man dropping into a defensive posture, while scanning assigned sectors for whatever had triggered his warning. He waved us forward cautiously, and as I approached his position, I saw what had stopped him. The ground was torn up, deep furrows in the soft earth that looked like something massive had been digging or possibly fighting, and scattered around the disturbed area were fragments of what had once been a backpack. The fabric was shredded, not cut cleanly, but ripped apart by tremendous force, and among the debris, I recognized the distinctive orange color of emergency supplies from a standard Forestry Service field kit. Brennan examined the site with the careful attention of someone who'd investigated too many ambush scenes, his gloved hands picking through the wreckage while the rest of us maintained security. "The damage pattern is consistent with large predator activity," he murmured, "but the distribution suggests the attack happened here, rather than the victim being dragged to this location. There's no blood trail, no signs of remains, which means either the victim escaped or was carried away completely intact." His tone suggested he didn't believe the escape scenario, and neither did I. Something powerful enough to destroy a reinforced nylon backpack wouldn't have trouble subduing a human being. What made the sight genuinely disturbing wasn't the obvious violence, but the details that didn't fit standard predator behavior. The backpack had been systematically emptied, its contents sorted and examined rather than simply scattered randomly. Food packages were torn open but not consumed. Medical supplies were scattered in a way that suggested deliberate searching rather than random destruction, and the victim's personal items, wallet, phone, identification, were arranged in a neat pile 10 feet from the main debris field. Animals don't organize evidence, don't display the kind of purposeful investigation that this scene clearly showed. Whatever had attacked here possessed intelligence that went far beyond instinctive predation. Kowalski was scanning the area with his thermal imaging scope, searching for heat signatures that might indicate recent presence, when his voice came through our headsets tight with confusion. "I'm picking up something weird about 30 meters east," he said. "Heat signature is off the charts, way hotter than ambient temperature. But the shape doesn't match any animal I've seen before. It's just sitting there, not moving, like it's watching us." Brennan signaled for a defensive perimeter, and we spread out to cover all approaches while maintaining visual contact with each other, weapons raised and fingers resting lightly on triggers as training and instinct took over. The thermal signature Kowalski had detected turned out to be the remains of a campfire, but not the kind of fire that campers or forestry workers would typically build. This was a massive pit, excavated deep into the earth and lined with rocks that still radiated heat hours after the flames had died. The size alone was wrong, requiring far more effort than any reasonable person would invest in a temporary fire, and the arrangement of stones showed a sophistication that suggested ritual or deliberate construction rather than simple utilitarian fire building. Scattered around the pit were bones, a lot of bones, picked completely clean and showing evidence of having been cracked open to extract marrow. Villalobos knelt beside the bone pile, his tactical light illuminating the grisly collection while he examined them with the careful attention of someone who'd seen enough death to recognize its variations. "These are deer," he said quietly, "probably 4 or 5 different animals based on the skull fragments. But look at the long bones. They've been split with precision, not just broken randomly. Whatever did this knew exactly how to maximize caloric extraction, and these bones are arranged deliberately, almost like they're being displayed for some purpose." His voice carried the kind of unease that you only hear from combat veterans when they encounter something that violates their accumulated understanding of how violence works. The fire pit's location bothered me more than its contents. It sat in a natural depression that provided excellent concealment from ground level, but would be visible from elevated positions in the surrounding trees. The arrangement suggested a gathering place, somewhere multiple individuals might congregate for purposes that went beyond simple feeding. Surrounding the pit were marks in the soft earth, impressions that looked like they might have been made by bodies sitting or crouching, and the spacing between these impressions indicated creatures significantly larger than humans arranged in what looked almost like a deliberate circle or semicircle formation. Brennan was photographing the site with his tactical camera, documenting evidence that would presumably be analyzed by specialists back at whatever facility processed this kind of information, when the first sound reached us through the darkness. It started low, so deep it was more vibration than noise, a rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself before rising into something that might have been vocalization. Not a howl, not exactly, but something that contained elements of mammalian throat structure, combined with articulation that suggested attempted speech, or at least complex communication. We went weapons ready immediately, each man orienting toward the sound source while maintaining awareness of our perimeter. The vocalization, if that's what it was, came from our northwest, maybe 200 meters distant, but the acoustics of the forest made it difficult to judge exactly. What made the sound genuinely unsettling wasn't its volume or the obvious power behind it, but the way it seemed to carry meaning, like we were hearing one side of a conversation being conducted in a language that human ears couldn't quite process into recognizable patterns. A response came from our southeast, different in pitch, but similar in structure, and then another from almost directly ahead. We were being triangulated, surrounded by sources of sound that were clearly communicating with each other and probably coordinating their positions relative to our location. Kowalski's voice came through the headset, barely a whisper. "They're talking about us," he said. "I don't know how I know that, but they're definitely talking about us." His certainty, despite the impossibility of understanding alien vocalizations, was the kind of instinctive recognition that mammals develop to survive in environments where other predators share the territory. Brennan made the tactical decision to fall back toward a defensive position, and we began moving with increased urgency while maintaining formation discipline. The sounds continued, sometimes close enough that we could hear the resonance of large bodies moving through underbrush, sometimes distant enough to suggest the sources were ranging widely around our position. Whatever was tracking us had numbers, coordination, and clear intent that went far beyond simple predatory interest. These weren't animals reacting to potential prey. These were intelligent beings conducting a deliberate operation with us as the focus. The trail we'd been following opened into a larger clearing, and what we found there made my blood run cold, despite years of combat experience and environments where death was a constant possibility. Suspended from a massive branch, at least 25 feet above the ground, was the carcass of an elk, a bull that probably weighed 600 pounds when alive, hoisted into the canopy with impossible strength and precision. The animal had been systematically butchered, choice cuts removed with surgical precision, internal organs harvested or discarded, but the head remained attached, and the eyes, those eyes were gone, removed cleanly and leaving empty sockets that seemed to track our movement with accusatory emptiness. More disturbing than the elk itself was the method of display. The rope suspending it wasn't rope at all, but twisted vegetation, saplings and vines, woven together with a skill that suggested practiced hands and considerable time investment. The height of the suspension meant that whatever had hoisted this massive carcass into place possessed either climbing ability that defied physics, or strength so profound it could simply muscle 600 pounds of dead weight up a vertical surface while maintaining the control necessary to secure it properly. This wasn't feeding behavior. This was a statement, a territorial marker that screamed ownership and capability to anything capable of reading the message. Villalobos pointed his weapon upward, tracking along the branch, and I saw what he'd spotted. Claw marks, deep parallel gouges in the bark that ran from ground level all the way up to where the elk hung, each furrow deep enough to expose the pale wood underneath. The spacing between individual claw marks suggested a paw or hand significantly larger than any bear I'd encountered, and the depth indicated force applied with casual ease rather than desperate struggle. Something had climbed this tree while carrying a 600-pound carcass, and it had done so without apparent difficulty. The smell radiating from the elk was overwhelming despite the cold night air. A combination of blood and meat and something else underneath. Something musky and organic that didn't come from the dead animal, but from whatever had handled it. That smell triggered recognition in some primitive part of my brain, activating flight responses that civilization in training had tried to override with logic and discipline. Every instinct screamed to get away from this place, to put distance between ourselves and whatever had created this grotesque display. But we were operators following orders in hostile territory, and retreat wasn't an option until we'd completed our reconnaissance objectives. Brennan was about to give the signal to move when our radios erupted with static so intense it was physically painful. We pulled our headsets away from our ears, but the interference didn't stop. It grew stronger, pulsing with a rhythm that was almost organic. Through the distortion, I could hear something that might have been breathing, deep and rhythmic, as if some massive organism was drawing air into lungs the size of oil drums. Kowalski frantically adjusted frequencies, trying to find a clear channel, but every bandwidth was saturated with the same corrupted signal. The radio interference wasn't random electronic noise, but something deliberately structured, almost as if it was being modulated by intelligence rather than natural atmospheric disturbance. Kowalski pulled off his headset entirely, his face pale in the green wash of night vision. "This is impossible," he said, his voice tight with professional confusion. "The signal is coming from multiple points simultaneously, all synchronized, which would require equipment and coordination that shouldn't exist out here. It's like something is broadcasting directly into our communication frequencies, with enough power to override military-grade encryption and jamming resistance." We switched to hand signals, falling back on the silent communication methods that special operations teams master precisely for situations where electronic systems fail. Brennan indicated we should proceed toward our primary objective coordinates, which lay approximately 2 clicks deeper into the forest along a ridge that would provide tactical advantage and hopefully some protection from whatever was tracking our movements. The sounds around us had changed, becoming more frequent and varied, as if whatever was out there had decided that stealth was no longer necessary now that it had made its presence undeniably clear. Movement caught my peripheral vision, quick and low, something crossing between trees, maybe 70 meters to our left. I swung my weapon toward it, acquiring the target area through my rifle scope. But by the time I had a clear sight picture, whatever it was had vanished into shadow and foliage. The glimpse was enough to register details that didn't compute with any wildlife I'd encountered. Too large to be a wolf, wrong proportions for a bear, and moving with a fluid grace that suggested bipedal locomotion rather than quadrupedal. Villalobos had seen it too, and his hand signal confirmed what we both knew. We were being paced, followed deliberately by something that wanted us to know it was there. The terrain began rising as we climbed toward the ridge, rocky outcroppings breaking through the forest floor and creating natural choke points that made me intensely nervous about ambush possibilities. Good ambush territory works both ways, and I found myself checking our rear constantly, expecting to see pursuit materializing from the shadows we just passed through. The forest felt different now, actively hostile, rather than merely indifferent, as if the trees themselves were complicit in whatever was happening around us. Ancient trunks loomed like pillars in some vast cathedral dedicated to forces that predated human understanding, and between them, darkness moved with purpose. Brennan called a halt at a defensive position, where large boulders provided cover and overlapping fields of fire. We formed a perimeter, each man covering a sector, while catching our breath and assessing our deteriorating tactical situation. The mission parameters had assumed we'd encounter wildlife, possibly aggressive wildlife, but nothing in the briefing had prepared us for coordinated stalking behavior from multiple entities that clearly understood military formations and communication systems. Whatever was tracking us had been watching humans long enough to learn our patterns, our technologies, our weaknesses. Kowalski managed to get partial radio function restored, enough to transmit a compressed situation report back to command. The response came through garbled and broken, but Ashford's voice was recognizable, despite the interference. "Proceed to primary objective and document findings," he said. "Extraction window opens at 050 hours. Maintain operational security and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary." The words were standard tactical guidance, but underneath them, I heard something else. A tone that suggested command knew more about our situation than they'd disclosed in the briefing, and that our actual purpose here went beyond simple reconnaissance. What they weren't telling us, what was becoming increasingly obvious as we pushed deeper into Zone 17, was that this mission was as much about confirming suspicions as gathering new intelligence. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, already knew what was out here. They'd sent us not to discover unknown threats, but to validate existing knowledge, and possibly assess the current capability and disposition of entities that had been operating in this territory for longer than military records would admit. We were bait and observers simultaneously, deployed to provoke a response that could be measured and analyzed. The ridge provided the tactical advantage Brennan had hoped for, elevated position with good sight lines down the slopes on either side. But it also made us more visible to anything watching from the surrounding forest. We could see movement now, multiple shapes circling our position at varying distances. Never close enough for positive identification, but clearly coordinated in their patrol pattern. They were hurting us, I realized with growing dread, using the terrain and our own tactical preferences to guide us exactly where they wanted us to go. Villalobos spotted it first, his sharp intake of breath drawing everyone's attention to what he'd discovered at the edge of our defensive position. Carved into a massive tree trunk were symbols, deliberate marks cut deep into the living wood, with something sharp and wielded by something strong. The patterns weren't random damage, but organized designs that suggested language, or at least symbolic communication. Some marks were fresh, sap still bleeding from the cuts, while others had weathered and scarred over, indicating this tree had been marked repeatedly over what might have been years, or even decades. The symbols defied immediate interpretation, geometric shapes combined with what might have been pictographs, but their very existence shattered any remaining pretense that we were dealing with ordinary predators. Animals don't carve messages, don't create deliberate visual communication systems that persist over time. These marks were territorial markers, warnings, or possibly historical records maintained by intelligence that operated on timescales and with purposes we couldn't begin to understand from our brief violent intrusion into their domain. Brennan photographed the symbols, his camera flash creating brief moments of harsh illumination that made the surrounding darkness seem even more absolute. "I wish we had a linguist," he muttered, "or an anthropologist, someone who might recognize patterns or cultural significance. Instead, we've got 8 shooters and a growing certainty that bullets won't solve this problem." His candor was unusual, officers typically maintaining operational confidence regardless of circumstances. But this situation had progressed beyond the point where pretense served any useful purpose. The attack, when it finally came, happened with such speed that our training barely kept us alive through the first 30 seconds. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, shapes that moved faster than anything that size should have been capable of, closing the distance from tree line to our position in seconds that felt like individual heartbeats stretched into eternity. The muzzle flashes from our weapons created a strobing effect, brief snapshots of impossible forms caught in moments of frozen light before darkness reclaimed them. I fired at the closest target, a shape that stood upright on 2 legs but possessed proportions that violated every assumption about bipedal anatomy. The rounds hit center mass. I was certain of the impacts. But the thing barely slowed, just released a roar that was part animal rage and part something that sounded horrifyingly like laughter before diving behind cover with tactical awareness that suggested military training. These things understood suppressive fire, understood how to use terrain for protection, understood that rushing directly into concentrated firepower was suicide even for creatures with their obvious physical advantages. Kowalski went down first, not killed but tackled by something that came from an angle we hadn't adequately covered. moving with speed that made it seem to teleport from one position to another. I caught a glimpse of massive shoulders, arms longer than human proportions allowed, and a head that was wrong in ways my brain refused to process even while my eyes recorded the details. It stood over Kowalski, one enormous hand pressing him against the ground while it studied him with what was unmistakably curiosity, examining his equipment, his weapon, his tactical vest, with the careful attention of someone conducting a scientific investigation. Villalobos put 3 rounds into the thing's torso from maybe 20 feet away, tight grouping that would have dropped any organic target, but it just turned toward him with what I swear was annoyance rather than pain. Blood, dark and thick, was leaking from the wounds, so we knew it could be hurt, but the damage that should have been immediately incapacitating seemed to be little more than an irritation. It released Kowalski and moved toward Villalobos with terrifying intent, covering the distance in 2 massive strides that demonstrated strength and speed far beyond human capability. The grenade Brennan deployed saved Villalobos's life, the fragmentation blast catching the creature in mid-stride and throwing it backward with concussive force that would have killed a normal human instantly. It went down, thrashing and roaring, but even wounded, it was trying to retreat rather than dying in place. Other shapes emerged from the darkness, grabbing their injured companion and dragging it back into cover with coordinated movements that spoke of practiced rescue procedures and unit cohesion that matched or exceeded our own military training. We used the momentary respite to fall back, Kowalski limping but mobile, Villalobos providing covering fire while we bounded backward using terrain features for concealment. The creatures, and there was no point pretending they were anything else now, didn't pursue immediately. They'd made their point, demonstrated their capability, and now they were regrouping and presumably reassessing their approach. We'd hurt one, proved that we could inflict damage, but the cost-benefit analysis was clear. Any sustained engagement would end with them winning through superior numbers, strength, and tactical position. The old logging road appeared almost miraculously, a break in the endless forest that represented the first man-made feature we'd encountered since insertion. The path was overgrown, but still navigable, and more importantly, it led downhill toward where our extraction point should be located. Brennan made the decision to follow it, sacrificing tactical caution for speed because our situation had deteriorated beyond the point where slow, careful movement offered any real advantage. They knew where we were, had demonstrated they could track us effortlessly, and our best hope was reaching the extraction zone before they decided to make another coordinated assault. We ran, abandoning stealth for desperate speed, boots pounding on the overgrown road while branches whipped at our faces and equipment. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit were clear and getting closer. Multiple heavy bodies crashing through underbrush with the confidence of predators that knew their prey was tiring. My lungs burned, legs screaming from the sustained sprint, while carrying 70 pounds of equipment, but fear and adrenaline pushed me forward because stopping meant becoming another disappearance statistic in Zone 17's growing casualty list. The road opened into a clearing that had probably served as a logging staging area decades ago, and in the center of that clearing sat our extraction helicopter, rotors already spinning as the pilots prepared for immediate departure. We sprinted the last 100 meters across open ground, completely exposed, while the tree line behind us erupted with shapes that poured into the clearing with numbers that confirmed our worst fears. There weren't just a few of these things, there were dozens, a full pack that had been coordinating their movements around us for the entire mission. Brennan reached the helicopter first, turning to provide covering fire, while the rest of us scrambled aboard. I was third to last, spinning around just in time to see one of the creatures standing at the clearing's edge, fully illuminated by the helicopter's landing lights for the first time. The image burned into my memory with perfect clarity, despite the chaos. It stood at least 7.5 feet tall, on legs that bent at angles, suggesting joints designed for both upright posture and quadrupedal sprint. The torso was massively muscled, shoulders grotesquely wide, arms that hung past where knees should be on a human frame. But it was the head that made my soul try to leave my body. The skull was elongated, stretched into something between wolf and human, covered in dark fur that couldn't hide the underlying bone structure that was fundamentally wrong. The jaw was heavy and prominent, filled with teeth too numerous and too large, designed for tearing flesh from bone with casual efficiency. But the eyes, those eyes were golden and intelligent and filled with something that looked uncomfortably like recognition, as if this creature understood exactly what we were and what we represented and found the entire situation somewhat amusing. It didn't attack, didn't rush the helicopter despite having the speed to potentially reach us before we lifted off. Instead, it watched with patient interest, occasionally glancing back at its packmates, who were gathering at the clearing's perimeter in numbers that made my hands shake. They were letting us go, the same way a hunter might release an animal too small to be worth the effort. And that recognition of our insignificance was more terrifying than any direct violence could have been. As the helicopter lifted off, I kept my eyes on that creature, watching it watch us depart. It raised one massive hand, not in threat, but in what might have been acknowledgement, or perhaps dismissal. And then it turned and melted back into the forest, followed by its pack in a coordinated withdrawal that demonstrated the discipline and cohesion of a military unit standing down after a successful operation. They'd made their point, established their dominance, and now they were returning to whatever existence they maintained in the deep wilderness. The flight back to base occurred in near total silence, each of us processing what we'd experienced while medics tended to Kowalski's injuries, which turned out to be severe bruising and several cracked ribs, but nothing life-threatening. The creature that had tackled him could have killed him instantly with those massive hands, could have torn him apart without apparent effort, but instead, it had simply pinned him and examined him like a scientist studying a specimen. That restraint was somehow more disturbing than outright violence would have been, suggesting calculation and purpose beyond simple, predatory instinct. Brennan was writing his after-action report during the flight, documenting events that would presumably be classified at levels that ensured they never saw public acknowledgement. I watched him struggle with terminology, trying to find official language that could capture the impossible things we'd witnessed without sounding completely insane. How do you write a military report that includes phrases like bipedal predators with apparent human-level intelligence and coordinated tactical behavior, suggesting extensive observation of military operations? The truth was going to sound like fiction, but we had the photographs, the recordings, the physical evidence collected from sites where these things had left their marks. When we finally reached the debriefing facility, Ashford was waiting, along with several individuals whose credentials suggested government agencies that operated far outside normal military channels. They separated us immediately, conducting individual interviews in rooms designed to prevent collaboration or consensus building. And the questions they asked made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd investigated encounters with what we'd faced. They knew about these things, had known for longer than any of them would admit, and our mission had been about confirming current population levels and behavioral patterns rather than discovering unknown threats. The biologists they brought in to examine the hair samples we'd collected looked at the results with resignation rather than surprise. The DNA doesn't match anything in our existing databases, she explained in a tone that suggested she'd delivered similar findings before. But there are markers that suggest mammalian evolution along a parallel track to Homo sapiens, possibly a relict population that avoided extinction during the Pleistocene by adapting to extreme ecological niches that humans couldn't exploit. The official classification would list them as unknown apex predators with unusual behavioral characteristics, but unofficially, we're talking about something that occupies a space between human and animal that shouldn't exist, according to conventional evolutionary theory. They kept us in isolation for 72 hours, running medical tests and psychological evaluations, while they decided what to do with operators who'd encountered something that officially didn't exist. The consensus seemed to be that we'd witnessed an extremely rare and aggressive wildlife phenomenon, possibly a hybrid population descended from escaped exotic animals or natural genetic mutations, and that the appropriate response was expanded monitoring rather than intervention. The territory those things claimed was remote enough that human-wildlife conflict could be minimized, through restricted access and careful management of the information we'd brought back. Villalobos cornered me in the facility's cafeteria on our second day of detention, his voice low and urgent. "They're going to bury this," he said. "File it away under classifications that ensure nobody who could actually do something ever sees the evidence. Those things are out there, they're intelligent, they're organized, and they've been living alongside human civilization for who knows how long while we pretended monsters were just campfire stories. And now, we're going to go back to our regular assignments and pretend we never saw what we saw because that's easier than admitting the natural world contains things that challenge our assumption of dominance." He was right, of course. Within a week, we were all reassigned to different units. Our team deliberately broken up to prevent the kind of shared narrative that might gain traction despite official efforts to contain the information. Kowalski went to a signals intelligence posting in Europe. Brennan took a training position at Fort Benning. Villalobos shipped to a security detail in East Asia. They scattered us across the globe, ensuring that any attempts to discuss our shared experience would be difficult and easily dismissed as individual delusion rather than collective truth. The official report, when I finally saw a redacted version, classified our encounter as probable interaction with an unknown species of large predator, possibly a relict population of megafauna previously thought extinct, and recommended continued monitoring of Zone 17 with restriction of civilian access pending further investigation. The photographs we'd taken were deemed inconclusive. The audio recordings attributed to natural acoustic phenomena amplified by unusual atmospheric conditions. The physical evidence filed in storage facilities where it would never be examined by independent researchers or public oversight. I returned to normal operations, running training exercises and occasional deployments to conflict zones where the threats were comfortingly human and therefore comprehensible. But Zone 17 haunted me in ways that combat stress never had. Because combat against human opponents made sense within a framework of tactics and strategy that had been refined over centuries of military doctrine. What we'd encountered in that forest operated outside those rules, demonstrated capabilities that made conventional combat training feel obsolete and inadequate. The nightmare started 3 months after our extraction. Vivid dreams, where I was back in that forest being stalked by shapes that moved faster than sight could follow. Sometimes I'd wake up convinced I could smell that distinctive musk, that combination of wet fur and blood, and something fundamentally organic that had permeated Zone 17. My therapist, a VA psychologist who didn't have clearance to know what I'd actually experienced, diagnosed combat-related stress disorder and prescribed medications that did nothing to address the core issue, which wasn't trauma from violence, but the existential horror of knowing that humans weren't alone at the top of the food chain. Villalobos reached out 6 months after we'd been separated, using encrypted channels and carefully vague language to avoid triggering whatever monitoring systems were probably watching former Zone 17 operators. He'd been doing research, he said, digging through historical records and folklore databases looking for patterns that might explain what we'd encountered. The results were disturbing in their consistency. Reports of similar creatures appeared throughout North American history, from indigenous legends predating European contact to frontier accounts dismissed as tall tales or misidentifications. The patterns suggested a population that had learned to avoid human detection, adapting their behavior as human presence expanded while maintaining territories in the most remote and inaccessible regions. Some of the accounts described creatures that could shift between forms, walking upright when stealth was required, but dropping to all fours for pursuit in combat. Others mentioned intelligence that manifested in tool use, symbolic communication, and coordinated hunting strategies that suggested language and culture. The common thread was always the same. Encounters occurred in remote wilderness, witnesses were rarely believed, and official investigations concluded with vague references to misidentification or hoax, despite evidence that suggested otherwise. The European folklore was even more explicit. Centuries of legends about beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal, cursed individuals who transformed under certain conditions or bloodlines that carried the capacity for change. The modern scientific consensus dismissed these stories as primitive explanations for rare medical, conditions, or psychological phenomena. But what if the folklore was actually accurate reporting of real encounters that got reinterpreted through cultural filters, until the factual core was buried under layers of supernatural embellishment? I started keeping my own records, documenting everything I could remember from that night in Zone 17, with the kind of detail that would survive even if my memory eventually degraded. The way those creatures moved, the coordination they displayed, the evidence of long-term territorial occupation and cultural practice. Someone needed to maintain an accurate account, even if it never became public knowledge, because the alternative was allowing the truth to be completely erased by official denial and bureaucratic classification. Brennan reached out a year later, requesting a meeting at a location far from any military installation or government facility. When we met in an anonymous diner in rural Pennsylvania, he looked older than his years, worn down by whatever internal conflict he'd been wrestling with since our return. "I've been contacted," he said quietly, stirring coffee he wasn't drinking while watching the door with habitual operational awareness. "People who work in areas adjacent to what we encountered. Researchers and military personnel who've had similar experiences in other remote locations. There's a pattern emerging, a network of sites where these things exist in viable populations, all carefully monitored and contained through restriction of access and management of information." The implication was clear. Zone 17 wasn't unique, wasn't even particularly unusual. It was one of many territories throughout North America, and possibly the world, where these beings maintained their presence while human civilization pretended they didn't exist. The government agencies tracking these populations operated under classifications that prevented oversight or accountability, making decisions about how to manage contact scenarios based on criteria that probably prioritized secrecy over safety. Our team had been deployed not as a response to a new threat, but as part of an ongoing monitoring program that had been active for decades or longer. "What bothers me most," Brennan continued, "is the question of what happens when these territories get encroached on by development or climate change. These populations have existed in equilibrium with human presence by maintaining distance and avoiding detection. But that arrangement only works as long as we leave them sufficient space. The forests are shrinking, wilderness areas getting smaller and more fragmented, and eventually, we're going to push these things into situations where avoiding contact becomes impossible. And when that happens, when confrontation becomes inevitable instead of occasional, I don't think humanity is prepared for what that conflict would look like." I'd been having similar thoughts, imagining scenarios where these creatures decided that defense of their territory required more aggressive action than the warning demonstrations we'd experienced. They clearly understood human capabilities, had observed us long enough to recognize our weapons and tactics, but they also possessed physical advantages that made conventional combat problematic at best. A sustained conflict between humans and a species that combined human intelligence with apex predator attributes would be unlike anything in military history, and the outcomes were difficult to predict with any confidence. The meeting ended with Brennan passing me contact information for the informal network he'd mentioned. Researchers and former operators who were quietly documenting encounters and trying to build a comprehensive picture of these populations, despite official efforts to fragment and classify information. It wasn't much, just a way to ensure that knowledge didn't get completely lost if individual witnesses died or were silenced, but it felt like resistance against the momentum of institutional denial. 3 years after Zone 17, I received an encrypted message from Kowalski containing satellite imagery of our former operation area. The forest looked unchanged from altitude, endless canopy showing no obvious signs of intelligent habitation. But he'd overlaid thermal data from multiple passes that revealed patterns. Heat signatures appearing in coordinated clusters, always during night hours, suggesting regular gatherings at specific locations. Movement corridors through the timber that showed evidence of being maintained, kept clear of growth that would impede passage. The data painted a picture of territory being actively managed by intelligence that understood land use and resource allocation. The message included a final note that made my skin crawl. Population estimate based on observed patterns suggests Zone 17 contains between 30 and 50 individuals, with evidence of juveniles indicating successful reproduction and multi-generational occupation. This is not an isolated population, but a thriving community with established social structure. They're not hiding from us anymore. They're just waiting to see what we'll do next. I think about that often now. The idea that somewhere in the wilderness that humans have claimed as recreation area or resource extraction zone, communities of beings that remember when they were dominant are watching our species and evaluating our actions. The encounter in Zone 17 wasn't a hunt or an attack. It was a message, a demonstration of capability, and a warning about the consequences of pushing too far into territories that were claimed long before human civilization existed. The official stance remains unchanged. Unknown wildlife, possible misidentification, insufficient evidence for definitive classification. But the operators who were there know better, and we carry that knowledge like a weight that never gets lighter. We saw what exists in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, encountered intelligence that challenges our assumption of uniqueness, and learned that the natural world contains predators that evolved alongside humans while developing capabilities that let them remain hidden until they choose to be seen. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep won't come. I wonder what would happen if these populations decided that coexistence wasn't working anymore. They have the numbers, the intelligence, the physical advantages, and most importantly, they have patience that comes from existing on timescales longer than human recorded history. We built our cities and convinced ourselves that we'd conquered nature, but in the deep forests where technology fails and weapons offer only temporary advantage, there are things that know better. The world pretends that monsters are fantasy, that the division between human and animal is absolute and clear. But I've stood in darkness and watched eyes reflecting back intelligence that was recognizably human in its awareness, while belonging to a form that nature never intended. I've seen coordination and culture in beings that official science refuses to acknowledge, and I know with the certainty that comes from direct experience that the line between civilization and wilderness is thinner than we like to believe. Patrolled by things that remember when humans were just another prey species struggling to survive. Zone 17 remains restricted, officially classified as environmentally sensitive habitat, requiring protection from human disturbance. The real reason, the one that doesn't appear in public records, is that it's safer for everyone if those territories remain undisturbed and their inhabitants left alone to continue whatever existence they've maintained for longer than our species has had written language. The agreement is unspoken but understood. We stay out of certain places, and they continue allowing us to pretend we're alone at the top of the food chain. I carry a scar on my throat from that night. Thin lines where claws rested against flesh with pressure that could have killed but deliberately didn't. Sometimes, I touch it and remember golden eyes studying me with recognition, acknowledging my existence while making it absolutely clear that my continued survival was a choice rather than a certainty. That creature had decided I wasn't worth killing, had marked me and released me to carry knowledge back to my kind about what exists in the places we don't control. The pack is still out there. I know this with absolute certainty because the monitoring continues, quiet and classified, but ongoing. Satellite passes that track thermal signatures, restricted flight zones that keep civilian aircraft away from certain coordinates, funding that flows to research programs investigating questions that officially don't exist. The government knows what's in Zone 17 and similar territories, has known for decades or longer, and has made the calculated decision that management through containment and information control is preferable to open acknowledgement or confrontation. And in the darkness, in the deep wilderness that we've marked on maps but never truly explored, packs of beings that are neither fully human nor fully animal continue their existence. They hunt, they gather, they raise young, they mark territories, and maintain social structures that predate our civilization. They watch the borders of human expansion with intelligence that understands causality and consequence. And they wait, patient as stone, for whatever comes next in the long, complicated relationship between species that share space, but not acknowledgement. If you're still reading this, If you've followed this account from briefing room to extraction, and through the aftermath that continues years later, then you carry part of the knowledge now too. The world is larger and stranger than official narratives admit, populated by intelligence that we've chosen to forget, rather than face the implications of its existence. Whether that choice will remain sustainable as human expansion continues, is a question I can't answer. But I suspect we'll find out eventually, probably sooner than anyone hopes. The world behind midnight continues its work, documenting the truth that exists in spaces between official acknowledgement and public awareness. Stories like this one, experiences that challenge comfortable assumptions about humanity's place in the natural order, persist despite efforts to classify them into oblivion. Someone needs to remember, needs to maintain the record of what actually happens when trained operators encounter apex predators that evolved intelligence alongside our own species. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight if you want to hear more stories about the things that exist in the margins of accepted reality. Share this account with those who can handle uncomfortable truths about what watches from the wilderness. And if you ever find yourself in remote territory where the forest feels wrong and silence presses against your awareness like a physical presence, remember what you've learned here and get out while you still can. The pack remembers, the pack waits, and somewhere in Zone 17 and territories like it, scattered across continents, beings that we refuse to acknowledge continue existing, patient and powerful and infinitely more aware of us than we are comfortable admitting. The nightmare isn't coming, it's already here, living alongside us in the places we don't look, and the only thing protecting us is their continued willingness to remain hidden. That willingness, I've learned, is not guaranteed forever.